let Donn Teske lead us on a tour of the cemetery. But each time we gather for a cemetery tour, we have just a few new people with us. So I think it would be nice for us just to go around and give our names and maybe where we're from. And we'll start with you.
Chet Winstor Jr. I'm from Wamego. My great-grandparents were buried here.
John Fairbanks. Granddad bought a farm just south of here in 1916, so that's why I'm here.
Ross and Debbie Manuel, and we just live over by Havensville. We just love cemeteries and the history of it.
Linda Price, I live down this road.
Thad Shepherd, she brought me.
Children over.
And who are you?
Okay. All right. Reba Boswell. I used to come with Mary Lee, but we used to go around and put a flower on the veterans' graves on Memorial Day. So I just live over here about a couple miles.
I'm Jolene Teske Cervantes, and I grew up on Red Hand Road down the way. Arnold and Lenora were my parents. Teske.
Rob Reeves, I'm just here to listen to the lecture.
I'm Linda Baxter, and I used to live on Day Road.
And I'm Debbie Burgess, the president of the Onega Historical Society. So Donn, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, good morning. I do things informally, so anybody has anything to contribute or challenge me on, have at it. I did make a set of copies that I think can go around if anybody wants to pull a paper, but she picked the Jenkins Cemetery to do it, and this is one of the cemeteries that when we do the senior class history tour, we bring them to, because it's a lot of the early history for the community started around here. And a lot of the information that I'm going to share came from the book Old Settlers' Tales, and the author of that wrote it about the turn of the century. It ain't the most accurate book in the world, but it certainly is entertaining reading, and it really gives the tales of the early settlers. And anyhow, if you're interested in the Vienna community, he focused a lot of his book on this area, so it's entertaining reading. According to their wall chart there, they have 70 burials here, 10 of which are veterans, 7 from the Civil War, 2 from World War II, and 1 from World War I. There's obviously many more burials than that here. In fact, I got a couple of names in here that says are buried here, you know, but they don't have stones. There's also one veteran, Furnham, that is listed and honored as a World War II veteran, and I doubt the accuracy of that, because he'd have been 67 years old when World War II started, so it probably is misidentified which war he served in, probably World War I. But anyhow, the opening narrative, it states, it talks about the day they formed the cemetery in the Old Settlers' Tales book, so if we can kind of mosey this way. One thing that is kind of ironic is 2 of the main people that I'm going to be talking about in regards to this community and cemetery aren't buried here, but we'll get there. Anyhow, when Major Jenkins' daughter Aladale died in February 1867, it was found necessary by the people of Vienna to locate a cemetery. Accordingly, messengers Benedict, Benton, Blaine, and Day met Mr. Jenkins, who agreed to give a piece of land to be set aside for a burial ground. The 5 men proceeded to walk over Mr. Jenkins' farm to select a suitable site. When Mr. Blaine, who was carrying a stick in his hand, using it as a cane, stopped, and planting the cane in the ground said, "This place suits me." So it was decided. And Major Jenkins' little daughter was interred 12 feet north of where Mr. Blaine had put his sticks. And that's Saladell right there. And that's obviously a later stone. And in fact, John and Deanna down on the farm down here probably has the original stone there. It's broken in half, but it's obviously a Jenkins name on it, and there weren't any others around here. But anyhow, a few months later, Mr. Blaine died, and he was buried in the exact locality which he had selected as suitable. This cemetery was chartered under the name of the Jenkins Cemetery, though it is usually called a Vienna Cemetery. And this is Mr. Blaine. So, I don't think probably very many cemeteries has that much documentation about the day it was formed. And so when you're out in the wilderness, at least they got above the floodplain here, I think.
Barely.
Anyhow, I've often talked and researched about Major Jenkins, and so he has two daughters here. One was an infant that died right away, and his wife Amelia died in 1899 and is buried here. He came through in 1858 with his brother-in-law L.J. Benedict and seen the country. He was from Kentucky, and there's a road to the west here named Major Jenkins Road. The local people know that. Is Richard W. Jenkins, and I had written a story about it, and one of mine in the paper, and afterwards Linda Tessendorf sent me the information because I put in there I couldn't figure out where he was buried. I'd checked county records and stuff, and she found him in Los Angeles, and so he's buried in Los Angeles. And the story, we'll get to it here, but anyhow, in 1861, his brother-in-law and his wife, which was Amelia's, do I have Amelia right? I'm not sure what. Yeah, but yeah, there you go. Her sister and her husband settled here in 1861, and in 1861, Major Jenkins came and visited them, and I better get my timeline right down here. In 1864, he visited his wife's sister's farm, L.M. Benedict, and his wife, here in Old Settlers' Tales, claimed her name was Anne. The tombstone says that it's Ruth, but this is her tombstone. And so this lady was a sister to Emily, and she died in 1869. Anyhow, what fascinates me about Major Jenkins is he was pretty flamboyant, used his title well. He was in the Cavalry, the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and so when he came to visit, he came from the Denver area. There's some ironic timing, because in April of 1864 he came and visited. In November of 1864 was the Sand Creek Massacre, when they pretty well wiped out Black Kettle's band in eastern Colorado. That was the 1st Colorado Cavalry. I have no proof that he was involved in that massacre, but my gut feeling is he was. You know, they were pretty proud of it at the time, but public sentiment turned violently against him, and not many people were admitting they were part of the massacre after that. And so in November of 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre, in spring of 1865, they were back here again. And then he mustered out of the military, and in March of 1866 moved here as their home. So I have no proof that he was involved in a massacre. I just have a feeling, because as I researched the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, that was stationed on the border of the Civil War, which would have been Missouri at the time. And so for him to be stationed out of Colorado, that was the 1st Cavalry that was stayed in Colorado. So there are some hints to it. Now, I've seen an entire roster of the 1st Cavalry that participated in the massacre, and his name isn't on it. I'm just speculating. I have that right. Anyhow, in March of, and he never got to be more than a lieutenant in the cavalry. And so in March of 1866, they moved here. Probably John and Deanna's farm right down here. He owned it for that time through there, and he owned other property and homes through the years here before he moved away. But probably that was the farm he was at. And 1866 and 1867, he was elected to the Kansas legislature each year. At that time, the elections were held annually. His buddy was the governor of Kansas, Governor Samuel Crawford. So Crawford appointed him commissioner of prisons in 1867 for the state of Kansas. In 1867, the daughter died and the cemetery was formed. And then in November of 1868, Sheridan put out a call for volunteers to help wipe out the rest of the Indians. And the Governor Crawford had higher aspirations, and so he put together the 19th Kansas Cavalry. It was all volunteers, and he did it in November of 1868. There were 1,200 men that volunteered. 3 of them were appointed majors, and Major Jenkins was one of them. And so they head south to join up with Sheridan at Camp Supply in Oklahoma. They get down to where Wichita is now, and there was just a few buildings there at that time. And then they had a guide that took them southwest toward Camp Supply through the Chalk Hills down there, they call them, or the White Hills or something like that down there.
Medicine Lodge area?
Yeah, Medicine Lodge area.
Yeah.
Anyhow, they got lost in a snow.
Gypsum Hills.
Gypsum Hills, there you go. They got lost, and a snowstorm hit them, and they ended up eating some of their horses, and finally scouts from Camp Supply found them and got them back there. And Custer got tired of waiting, and that morning that they rode into camp, he had left, and that was the Washington Massacre down there where they killed off Black Kettle and the rest of the band. So he could have possibly been involved in both massacres, except they got lost in those Gypsum Hills. And so anyhow, in April of 1869, the 19th was demobilized at Fort Hays. So Major Jenkins' entire career as a major lasted 5 months. And so, but he used that title for the rest of his life, and it was a voluntary group. So, yeah. Like I said, he was good at that. So, 1874, he bought a threshing machine in partnership with Ben Busby. That failed. 1877, it just says that he was instrumental in bringing the railroad on from Holton to Onaga. And then after that, he made a career in railroading. And so his wife Emily died in 1899. And then Deanna, in her research at the Historical Society, found a blurb of a society notice from Denver that Major Jenkins married Marie McGuire in 1904 in Denver. In the society pages it says. And her tombstone says Mary. That piece said Marie. I don't know, who cares. But anyhow, Mary was 25 years old. Major Jenkins was 73. So.
Oh, Major.
Yeah. They had a daughter.
Oh my.
Romaine Alice Jenkins, and she died. Was born in 1905, died in 1911 in California. So anyhow, her parents are listed as Moses and Diana McGuire, and they were early settlers here. And their graves are in the military cemetery at Los Angeles. And so they're not buried here. But the Old Settlers Tales book did a really good job of documenting Moses' children. And Mary or Marie isn't one of them. And so I'm sitting here going, here's this kind of flamboyant guy, got married in Denver to a 25-year-old. Does he need to give her some history or be generous about things, you know, society-wise? And then they moved to California.
Wasn't too happy.
If I could have made it to Manhattan or Topeka before this, I got tied up in my job, I would have done some research on Ancestry.com and see if I could have tracked Mary back, because I just don't know. If it wasn't for the fact that Moses and his wife are buried in Los Angeles, I'd be really suspicious. Because this McGuire was an old family name from back home, and
Well, but her okay, Moses was her dad.
yeah,
Well, her grandparents are here.
yeah, yep,
The McGuires.
yeah.
Moses.
If she's really a McGuire,
McGuire, right.
and she wasn't some hooker that he married in Denver and needed to give credibility to.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm suspicious when I read some stuff.
I've done a little research. I think she probably was a McGuire.
Probably was. And you were, especially where her parents are buried out there where she would have been. So she was born in 1879 and died in 1971. And so, you know, I did a lot of online searching and I couldn't find an obituary or anything in 71. I probably should have. But she was 35 when her husband died. He died in 1914 at the age of 83, so probably got married again. So probably I don't have the information I need to track her down. So anyhow, that was Major Jenkins that this cemetery is named after.
And what was his real name?
Richard W. He's from Kentucky. And the papers that Debbie has, I got a picture of their tombstone in there in Los Angeles. And I also printed off what Deanna sent me about the wedding. So, his brother-in-law, Ellen Benedict, who buried his wife here in 1869, like I said earlier, he traveled through here with Major Jenkins in 1858, came here in 1861 to settle. In 1869, his wife Betsy, or Ann, died, buried in Jenkins Cemetery. I guess I'm inclined to believe the tombstone, it's an old one. And this would have been written 20 years after she died, so, you know, memories. Anyhow, in 1872, he married Mary Keyes from Wabansie. So 1873 he moved to Wabansie. In 1911 he buried Mary in Wabansie Cemetery, and in 1923 he died and is buried in San Diego, California. So, two of the kind of the main early guys here aren't even buried here, but they got family buried here. Jared Furman.
They're right down here on aren't they, John?
He's the one that I think probably is listed wrong. He'd have been 67 years old when the war started, and I doubt that. Uncle Lester Teske joined when he was 40, World War II, but 67. And Claire Mumwa, which is right here.
There.
He was killed in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge in 1945. And his body returned here in 1947, according to the board. I've got pictures of him in the battles that he was in, that he was killed.
How's it spelled?
M-U-M-A-W, Claire, C-L-A-I-R-E.
Mumau.
Mumau.
Well, known as Mumau.
There's a bunch of Mumau's right here, too.
way the stone, Lloyd and Genevieve ended up getting the stone and put it there in memory, but I question whether his remains is there or not. And the reason why I say that, if you look at the obituary tells you that he was buried in Germany. He was in the Battle of the Bulge and was killed in January.
That would agree with what I speculate, because it says on there his body was returned in 1947, so that would have been returned after the obituary was written.
The reason why I question that, times was hard, and I would question whether Lloyd and Genevieve had the money to, at that time, and our good US of A, as it is, was not doing DNA and bringing bodies back to, you might want to research that.
Doesn't really matter.
No, but I'm just saying. I'm just saying.
Okay, won't argue with you.
Oh. And where I fall in on that, my dad and Claire was a second cousin to my father. Lloyd and Dad were first cousin, Meemaw, at that time, and still alive.
Okay. You probably know more than I do then. Yeah. Well, I made a list of just other note stuff. Charles Lieb came here in 1867, died in 1875. He would have been one of the earlier ones. Edgar Lewis came in 1855, according to Old Settlers' Tales, but I doubt that. 1855 was just a year or so early. But died in 1927. He bragged that at one time he owned Onega. He owned at one time the land Onega sits on.
Donn, is that Carl Lewis's dad?
I don't know. I wonder.
We have quite a bit of Edgar Lewis stuff.
Yes,
War
it
in the
is.
museum.
It is.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah, see, you guys all know more about it than I do. Frank Day came here in 1861, and Old Settlers' Tale says he's buried here, and there's no stone. So Frank Day would be one of them that'd be buried here that's not marked. His son, John Day, drowned in the Vermilion while crossing in high water on horseback on July 3rd, 1869, and so is he buried here. Cemetery started in 67, he drowned right here in 69. I bet he's here.
Yeah.
And that was ironic because him and two others were...
What about your over at your place?
Right. I think I've read some of that too, and I thought the son was brought up on the hills and buried there, up there on in my pasture on Victory Road. There's a great big old niggerhead, excuse me for using terminology, but I can't see any sign on it. But we always wondered whether that boy was buried up there, because I understood that in the
He's
going to cross the Vermilion and he drowned it when it was in flood time. Okay, but I don't know because that was part of the day ranch. Because I don't know when I was a child too, there was a Mose Day that lived up there from the schoolhouse just west a little bit on that dirt road, and I just wondered whether Mose Day was related to that Charles Day.
Yeah, they were, Frank Day and Moses Day were brothers.
Okay.
There were a lot of Moses Days. So
well, I know
Moses Day was also a nephew of Frank and...
Well, the place I live on was a Velma Clark, but Velma was a day before she was married, so I don't know who her father was. And Lorna Malone across the road, that she inherited part of that too when her dad died, as part of the day land.
The old man, Moses Day, the original, he's buried up in Onega Cemetery up on the peak of the hill. And so he died right at the turn of the century. But anyhow, that John, they were at Moses Days and had planned to do a July 4th celebration there in 1869. And so him and two others went back to Frank Days place to get a sheep to take back to butcher for the celebration, and the river had come up, and that's when he drowned as they were trying to cross it to get a damn sheep to butcher. And so, I certainly could be, especially where it's your own land.
It looks like a cemetery. I mean, it just kind of. I've been there on trail ride, and it looked like a cemetery.
Dan, is that where you went to Witch? I thought Reba had someplace.
No, I haven't done that, no.
Anyhow, the book says Frank Day is buried here. Edge McGuire down here that you're going to talk about was a school teacher, and then I was going to point out that there are 2 burials here that were both born in the 1700s and well into the 1700s. And I know Deanna wants to talk about the one. She's over here. And the other one is that stone laying flat, and he lived at Orissipi. And so that's a name you don't hear very much. Orissipi Road is over here. Well, that was a ghost town and post office of Orissipi. So. Yeah.
Somebody walking down there?
Deer hunting.
Yeah. So anyhow, that's kind of most of my stuff. I have a last page in here that's just kind of some interesting gossip I'd read as I was nosing through it. Talks about the post office. They got their, when Mr. Corey first came to Mill Creek, he with his neighbors did his trading at Leavenworth. They also got their mail there for about a year. Then they got their mail at St. Mary's, when each neighbor would take turns about to go after the mail for the whole community. The mail being gotten once a week. About 1858 or 1859, a post office was established at America City, and this seemed to be to the pioneers as if they were in there getting their mail right at home. Then during the war, a post office of Vienna was established, and on the August Wagner place, Jake Mensch being the first postmaster. So that would have been during the 1860s that Vienna had a post office established there. But before that, they had to go quite a ways to get their mail.
A lot of those post offices in Pot County did not last long. Some of them lasted 2 years, 4 years. The longevity back then, because the post office was actually in people's homes at that time.
Okay, I was just wondering, my mother taught school here at Vienna 2 years. I think it was in 1924 and 25, and she had written something about it. She said when she, as a child, she was born up there by Fairview, and she rode her horse down here to teach for 2 years. But she said at that time she was, before, as a child, they used to come down here to church and Sunday school, and there was a post office, there was a blacksmith shop, and what else? I think those are the main things that was here, and a store. So I don't know, where was it, Vienna? Where was the town side, where the school was?
The old maps that I look at, that I try and locate it, it would be where the Stone Arch Bridge is to the east.
What now?
To the east of where the Stone Arch Bridge is, up in the pasture up that way, is what the old maps that I look at kind of pinpointed. If the school was here, that may be where it all was. I don't know.
Well, you know, there was a crossing on the Vermilion too. I think I've read that someplace down here, but I don't know where you crossed exactly.
Slagle says there's foundations in these pastures out here. So, I don't know.
Okay. About every 80 had a farm on it at one time, but yeah.
I think by the Stone Arch Bridge there was a road one time that went up on the hill there Canyon Trail.
Yeah, the Canyon Trail.
I'll say yes, we did that when I was a kid. If you were very careful, you could drive around the hills and get up to Fairview area, because that's where my grandparents were. But that wasn't, and we rode our horse up there quite often as a child. 14 or 15, I'd go up that way.
By the time
You know, I don't have a lot more information. I tried to do some more research on the Civil War veterans, and I just didn't come up with a whole lot with the time I had to look. So
I have a little bit. The Mays over here, Seth May, there's 2 Mays buried here that were in the Civil War. And there were 4 May brothers in the Civil War. George is buried in the Onega Cemetery, but I saw Seth May. You can tell because they have the Gar star. I think he's right there, and I think there's another, his brother is buried here too.
Deanna, you were going to talk about...
Is somebody going to talk about McGuire?
Yeah, I think he would like to, so yeah, whichever way you want to head here.
Well, there isn't much to add to it. That Levi and Nancy Nevins McGuire are buried there. The stone gives the dates. Then from that family, offspring was my grandma Susie McGuire Winstor. So from that, then Ida was the oldest of the family, and she married Clark Mumal. They're buried right there. And of that offspring then, of Ida and Clark, that was Lloyd and Otis. Lloyd then lived over here, up over the hill, and Lloyd then, the offspring of that was Claire and senior moment, Lyle, was the 2 from that family. But there's a lot of McGuires that went to Oklahoma and are buried down in Oklahoma. I have the dates and everything on that. I have all the family history of the brothers and sisters. And with that, you got any questions, I'll try to answer them.
Where Harold and Dorman fit into the McGuires?
There was an agent, A-D-J-E-T, I think, McGuire, and they're in that offspring of that. And I'd have to get, I don't have it memorized, but I do have the history on that, John. That's where they fit into it at. There was a lot of them. And of course then Dorman and Harold and Marvin, there was only 3 children of Ace McGuire, Ace and Flora. Ace and Flora lived out here on the farm, I don't know what the date, then they moved to Onega, and across from where on the corner where the first Onega Health Center was put up in the hospital there. They live on the east side of the Main Street there, Leonard Street.
All 3 of the McGuires played band instruments, didn't they? They had a band, didn't they?
Well, yeah, they was pretty, and my grandma played piano. There was a lot of musically inclined. Otis then, he formed handbells later in his life then too, at the church. So yes, music was in the McGuire family.
So one of
Harold was in the service,
I think so.
Was he, Jolene?
I think so. And was Alta McGuire a Mumal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, she was.
That was Dorman's wife was a Mumal.
Right, yeah. She was.
I'd always heard a story about when Harold was in the service, him and Dorman were farming together then, and Dorman wrote to Harold and wanted to buy a new idea corn picture. Harold wrote back and told him, you better lay off them new ideas.
Well, to interject another one, my grandpa Ted Winstor said that tractors is the ruination of farming, that they'll pack the ground, horses is the best way to go. Him and Grandma was at the day ranch at that time, south here, for the ones that know where the Day Ranch is at, it's south of the Rezaks on the west side of the road. Grandma, there was a big 2-story house there. The way I was told, there was a bunkhouse there. There was a lot of hired men and my grandma cooked for all of that clan. And then Grandpa was the foreman on that ranch, and that's when they ended up saving up $4,000. And in 1928, they bought what is now the Rezak farm on the east side of the road. And in March of '36, they had lost it already, putting the farm sold for $12,000. They had $4,000 down, they had $8,000 to pay and couldn't make the payments.
Yeah. Well, that's where Linda lives.
And that's where Linda lives.
Yeah, I have the bell that you rang when people were to come, because through Velma Clark, that bell had traveled over to the ditch by the Stone Arch Bridge, and somebody shot a hole through it. But anyway, so my sister Rosie retrieved it. We found the history of the bell, and then she built a deal to put the bell on. Well, that fell apart. Well, I had like an arbor built out of horseshoes and hames and pipe, and it has the bell on top. So that bell is still usable if somebody wants to go ring it. But somebody shot through it.
With a hole shot through it?
Yeah, it's got the hole shot through it. Wow. So I put it back up. I had a guy build that for me.
So how much land here did the Days?
At one time, the Day Ranch was over 3,000 acres. That's in the history books there too. They had, I forget how much livestock, unbelievable amount of horses, over 150 head of horses at that time. But I found it in those old settler tales also. But then that went on to become then the Krause
Cattle Company.
Right, cattle company.
They're here.
Right.
They're there.
Right.
That's where the Winters live.
Yes. Because Jack Winters worked for him and kept everything under control. It used to be one of the most beautiful farms in the valley.
Yes, it was.
Used to be.
Well, did that part of that land, did they get that from the railroad? Is that why they land on either side of the railroad, the Day Ranch? Part of it?
I heard that he bought it with a wagon load of whiskey.
Well, my deed says he bought it from an Indian whose first name started with A. He bought that 160, but things got traded. And I'd heard a barrel of whiskey, an old horse, barrel of flour, jug of whiskey, and an old horse. That's the story I heard on that. So, anyway, it says $100. It says he paid $100.
Well, you think about it, even in 1928, to save up $4,000 was pretty awesome for Grandma and Grandpa. It definitely was.
So I got another McGuire story I just ran across in the book that I thought was entertaining. The book made a great point that it isn't a McGuire that is relation to the local McGuires. Francis McGuire. And he moved in here with his wife from Indiana. And a man by the name of Benton came with him who has a sawmill, which he runs near the Lewis Fulton home. Anyhow, Mr. McGuire took his wife back to Indiana where she is still living. So she came out here and didn't like it, he took her back. And then he went on a buffalo hunt in company with a man by the name of Coleman, who lived on the DeGraw farm. And while gone, Mr. Coleman was accidentally shot. Mr. McGuire married Mrs. Coleman afterwards.
Oh, God.
So,
Yeah.
You know,
I think there's a Bible story about that too.
yeah, I thought it sounded familiar, David. But
That's too good.
when they go on buffalo hunts here, that would be in the Clay Center, Waterville areas where they'd go out to. And there's one story in there that they went out with 7 wagons and shot enough buffalo to load it all down with boned out meat and brought it home. And then they'd go out and when the heat of the summer and shoot them and just render it down into tallow. Fat and tallow was so precious here, protein. And one story was, and I said this in Oneida the other night, so I don't want to get redundant, but said Moses Day caught a couple of buffalo calves out there once, and so he brought them back with the intention of taming them down and breaking them to the yoke. And then the Civil War broke out, and he went off to the war, and they grew up and got really rambunctious, and they ate them. And so,
Yeah, I've read that too.
So, anybody else with some stuff here?
Here we go. Okay, ready? I'm on. Okay. We're coming over here. I wanted to talk to you about this if you were at the last tour in Onega about the stone, and then we'll talk about the lady who has the stone. But this is a stone. It's metal. It's made out of zinc, and they're really kind of cool because this lady died in 1872, and this thing looks like it was put in yesterday. So they tend to hold up real well. So these type of tombstones are pure zinc, and then as they oxidize, they get a zinc carbonate, which is rust resistant. So that's why these things tend to last so long. They called them white bronze. Not that there's any bronze to it, but it made them sound fancier. And then a zinc stone, a zinc marker. So 2 men, M.A. Richardson and C.J. Willard, are credited for perfecting the means of casting these metals in 1873. They didn't have the capital to produce them themselves, so they contacted a W.W. Evans, and he quickly gave up on the idea and sold the rights to Wilson Parsons and Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut. So basically there was one company making these in the entire United States, and it was in Connecticut. So basically people would pick out their designs, they'd do plaster casts. Okay, then they'd make them out of wax, carve the wax, do the plaster casts, and then pour the zinc. They were done in pieces and then fused together using hot zinc. So the seams and stuff were all zinc. The Monumental Bronze Company made graveyard monuments from 1874 to 1914. And then the government took over the plant for manufacturing munitions during World War I. And after the war was over, the demand for the monuments faded away and they dissolved in 1939. So World War I kind of took care of the company. The price could be ranged from $10 to as much as $5,000. And they were completely sold by basically traveling salesmen. There was no central location where you went to order your stone. The guys traveled around, and then they had catalogs too also. So the problems with these, the cement foundations weathering and dissolving, and then they fall over, and then some of the welds were faulty, so the welds would give away, and if somebody hit them with the lawnmower, they're kind of fragile if you run into them. And also some of these, and I was going to pass around some pictures, but some of these zinc monuments were huge, and just the weight of the zinc settling down would cause the bases to start buckling, and that's a real problem because they say there's really no way to really repair them very effectively. So let's see, and so basically they thought they quit after World War I. They just weren't, the uppity-up people or whatever, they weren't popular with the in crowd, so they just, everybody wanted to do they thought the stone monuments were better, so that's kind of reason why they kind of fizzled out. So I want to talk about this is Mrs. Theodosia Bissell Smith. She was born in Torringford, Connecticut on June 24th, 1784, and she died here in Vienna, Kansas, September 12th of 1872. She was 88 years, 2 months, and 18 days old. So when I first started coming out to the cemetery and I saw this, it's like, you know, who is she? Why is she here? Her Find a Grave memorial at the time had her name spelled wrong, so you couldn't even look her up because the name was spelled wrong. So this has kind of been an ongoing process for me because I was so curious as to why this lady from Connecticut is buried in this cemetery. So basically, it actually makes sense once you figure it out. So I did some research probably a year and a half ago, wasn't finding much, so just a couple weeks ago I thought, you know, I'm gonna just Google her name. So I Googled her name, and it came up with a Congregational Church history book thing on Google Books. And so basically her daughter, Lucretia, married Louis Edward Sykes. And he's kind of interesting. He was a minister. So basically he studied, he was born in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1810. He went to Brattleboro Academy, Amherst College, Union College, Auburn Theological Seminary, and Yale Theological Seminary. So this guy was well educated. So anyway, he married Lucretia Smith, who was her daughter, and so he served in Vermont, Illinois, Michigan, and then he became the acting pastor for the Vienna, Kansas Congregational Church from 1870 to 1877.
And there's a book written by Reverend Bill Sykes, or anyway, about how he came to Kansas. And I've got it somewhere. And
if you could find that, I would be very interested.
They came up and they went to school here, and how Moses Day had his longhorn cattle around, and they would be wandering through the schoolyard. And
cool.
Yeah, I have that somewhere in my house.
Cool.
You find it.
So and then that was from 1870 and 1877, and then it says without charge in Vienna from 1877 to 1884. So I'm assuming he fell out with the Congregational Church or something, or went on his own, or did something. So she died in 1872, which falls right into when he was pastoring here in Vienna. So she must have been elderly. They were taking care of her mother, and she died, and they buried her here. So that solved my, it's actually not that complicated, but because when I was on Ancestry.com, everybody's family trees have her dying in Connecticut. And it's like, but she's right here, so anyway, so that's kind of a story about Theodosia.
So do you know where the pastor is buried?
He is in Leonardville. Okay, so from Onega, after the Leonardville, after 1884, and he and his wife are buried in Leonardville.
Yeah.
That's like store.
Yeah.
So you guys know more.
Army surplus stuff there. They sold all this. And my old horseshoe, as a kid, he bought his. I remember he told me about his combat boots, but I remembered him from when I was a kid. He had his combat boots on.
So that must have been another, maybe a grandkid.
You got everything from the Army. They were getting rid of it, and that store there.
Interesting.
And but I remember he said he was as tall as he was wide, and he wore combat boots. And he was the only kid at Westmoreland horse shows with combat boots on. And then years and years later, he ended up being my horseshoe.
This is really kind of amazing. We have a picture of Reverend Sykes and his wife that I was going to post after we came here, that I found with this Congregational Church history at the museum. And it also, the Congregational Church in Wheaton, this Reverend Sykes actually kind of started that church, but it started up at Clear Creek, I think it was. But when the railroad came through, the churches moved to wherever the town was established. So he was in Vienna, but he also is credited with starting the Onega Congregational Church.
That's why there used to be a congregational cemetery out there in the country.
Yeah.
By Hefner's.
The original Congregational church that he helped start was not in Wheaton. It was at Clear Creek.
That's That's probably why that cemetery was up there.
Yes.
Still is.
Still is.
It isn't actually, but it's boarded up. Building's still there. One, you know, there used to be 3 churches and we Catholic and Lutheran.
That's just amazing how these little pieces are falling into place, falling together as we go to these different cemeteries.
So how many cemeteries around have the zinc heads like this that you're aware of?
There's one in Onega, and one here. They're not very common in this area that I've come
Probably
across.
because of the expense of them.
Well, they're actually probably less expensive than some of the stuff.
Well, yeah.
But I think it's just, I mean, you had to get them from Connecticut. I mean, they made them, you know, you had to get the design and get it there and then get it back here. It's probably more of a logistics thing. I don't know.
Now, Chet, the one in Onega Cemetery is bigger. And I remember when I was running around in high school, there was a tombstone we would knock on, and it would knock back. Well, I think it's the zinking, because when you knock on it in Onega, it's big enough it echoes.
Okay. I'll be.
Well, we could gently see if that one worked. As long as it doesn't.
All right.
One of you looked, I think the Onega Cemetery was the thing before the one that's made out of
When
quartzite.
I went up there, they were different designs.
When I take the seniors around on these history
Committed
tours,
today.
by the time we get to Jenkins Cemetery, they go, man, we've been to a lot of cemeteries today.
Well, I'm going north.
I do
up there.
have a handout that Dawn provided for everybody.
Down by Charlie
Well,
Lee's.
what's a church here in
Is what the gold is
Vienna?
now.
Where was it located?
I don't know.